Hi, everybody, and welcome to our Tergar Live monthly event today. My name is Stephanie Wagner. I'm a Tergar facilitator. I also have the good fortune of working with both Cortland Dahl as well as Richie Davidson at Healthy Minds Innovations, and I'm delighted to be the moderator for our webinar today. As we're getting started and just waiting for people to join on YouTube, I'd love for you to share via the chat on YouTube where you live. We'd love to know a little bit about who's in the audience today for this special event. And so today our topic is going to be all about rewiring our brain to flourish. This is a sneak peek of a larger event that's going to be taking place April 10th and 11th with Cortland Dahl and Richard Davidson, and really excited to dive into this topic with you today. So, Court, I would love actually for you to maybe just share a little bit about your background, your academic background, by way of introduction.
Sure. Yeah, this has been a huge part of my professional life for many decades, actually. I'm one of these people who has kind of a whole mixture of roles. There's no kind of simple summary, but I have a role as a scientist at the Center for Healthy Minds. I have a related role as the Chief Contemplative Officer at the center's affiliated nonprofit, Healthy Minds Innovations. And this is in addition to the work I do with Tergar, of course, where I've been very involved from the beginning, but currently serve as the executive director. But I'd also like to say that actually for me, despite the professional part of this has really just been a very personal journey for me. So we're talking about the brain, well-being, meditation, and all the amazing science that is happening in this area. So despite the professional side of this, for me, actually, it really started when I was in my early 20s, maybe even earlier than that, maybe even 19 or 20. And I was going to university and I was struggling with anxiety and just looking for something to really work with my mind at a very difficult time in my life. So that was when I stumbled upon the practice of meditation. That then awoke this interest in me that has really defined my life and has kind of led to all the work that we're doing, with you, Stephanie, and many others at the Center for Healthy Minds. So that's just a bit about my background that has kind of led to this work that we're doing now.
Wonderful. Well, as we're getting ready to dive in here, just an overview of what to expect from our time together today. We're going to be here anywhere between probably 45 minutes to an hour. I'm going to be facilitating a little bit of a dialogue with Court for the first part of our time together. Again, it may be around 30 minutes or so, and then we're going to open it up for a Q&A from the audience. So as you're hearing Court talk about key things in his presentation today, would love to invite you to share any questions that you have via chat, and we will take as many of those questions as we can for the second half of our session together. So, Court, you mentioned that you're affiliated with the Center for Healthy Minds and Healthy Minds Innovation. So I'm wondering if actually you could share just a little bit about those two organizations and their work in the world as a way of sort of setting the tone for our talk about the framework.
Yeah, I'd love to. So the Center for Healthy Minds and the nonprofit Healthy Minds Innovations are both located here in Madison, Wisconsin, where I am right now. And the center is a part of the University of Wisconsin here in Madison. And the work that we do goes back decades. So back starting really in the 80s, then ramping up in the 90s, the work that we were doing, which started with the work of Dr. Richard Davidson, who's one of the most well-known neuroscientists on the planet, was really looking at the neuroscience of emotions. So in particular, looking at some of the struggles that we face, things like depression and anxiety, and really just trying to understand what's going on in the brain when we have these emotional experiences. And then there was a turning point for Dr. Davidson that, again, goes back to the 90s, where he began to meet and collaborate with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And the Dalai Lama really challenged him. He basically said, look, you're using these amazing tools of modern science to study things like fear, anxiety, depression, all of these destructive or challenging emotional states. Why don't you also examine things like compassion and appreciation and mindfulness, a lot of the more positive end of the spectrum. And that really led to a huge change at the university and the scientific work that Dr. Davidson was doing at the time, and eventually to the founding of the Center for Healthy Minds and the nonprofit, which was formed a few years after that. So it started with this focus on the neuroscience of challenging destructive emotions, and then eventually led to what is now known as contemplative science, which is not only the science of well-being and human flourishing, but also the neuroscience of how we can train the mind and even literally rewire the brain to forge new connections in the brain that support both resilience and human flourishing. So that work is really at the center of what we do here at the Center for Healthy Minds at the university. And it's really just amazing to see all the doors opening in the wider world as well. So it's extended far beyond our scientific research to everything from government policy to working with organizations, and of course, connecting with countless people around the world who, like the two of us, I know you have a similar story, Stephanie, who just were needing some tools in our lives to work with all of the challenges we face as humans.
And so a word that's used a lot in this work is flourishing. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what we mean when we say what it means to flourish in our lives.
Yeah, one of the challenges of studying well-being or human flourishing even more so is that it's kind of a fuzzy term. I think we kind of recognize it when it happens, but as scientists, we really need to know what it is. If you want to study something scientifically, you need to be able to define it, because you need to be able to measure it. And if you haven't defined it, if you haven't quantified it in some way, you can't really measure it scientifically. So we have spent a lot of time trying to find ways to scientifically study things like human flourishing. And I think the first thing I would say about it, despite the obvious point, which is that it's complex, is that flourishing, or well-being, you could say more broadly, is different than happiness. So happiness, you could say, is a little bit simpler in that it's positive emotion. It's a feeling of joy or elation or inspiration. It's a positive emotional experience. But to experience well-being, to be thriving or flourishing, doesn't necessarily mean that we feel happy or we're experiencing a positive emotion in the moment. So for example, if you are with a friend who's really struggling, say, you've had a hard time, and we probably all have had many experiences like this these days, where somebody has experienced a big setback or experienced loss, and we're supporting a friend through a difficult time. Of course, we don't want to feel happy. That's not the experience of flourishing in that moment. It might be a feeling of deep empathy, right? It might be a feeling of being able to share their experience and to mirror back to them their own strength and resilience. So it might look very different in the moment than happiness. So I think you could say that there's sort of two elements to this. On the one hand, well-being, if I could kind of take a little bit beyond flourishing, you could say that well-being involves resilience. In other words, when we encounter challenges, when we encounter adversity, how is it that we can bounce back from that? Not only not be overwhelmed, but when we're at our best, we might even learn and grow through adversity. So there's one key element of well-being that is really about adversity and how we deal with challenges. On the positive end, and this speaks more to what you asked about, when things might not be going really poorly, but maybe things are going okay, how can we really flourish? How can we thrive? And what does that actually look like? So again, it's the kind of thing that we know it when it happens. We know we've all had experiences where maybe things are going okay on the surface, but we don't really feel okay. And then we might not have other times where things are going and it just really does feel like we're at the top of our game. So we've really tried to pinpoint some of the key dimensions of flourishing. In other words, specifically what is happening, not only psychologically and emotionally, but even biologically, when we experience these peak moments, when it really feels like we are at our best. So I could share a little bit about this, but this is really what has led to the scientific framework that we've developed at the Center for Healthy Minds that focuses on 4 key pillars of well-being. And I imagine we'll talk more about these, but this is kind of the ingredients, you could say, of well-being, which certainly are the ingredients of flourishing and thriving when things are going well for us.
Yeah, that leads very naturally actually to my next question, which is, through your work with Richie and at the Center for Healthy Minds, you have developed this unique scientific framework of well-being. So I'm wondering if you could provide just a little bit of an overview of this framework of well-being and the different components.
Yeah, I'd love to. This has been a huge part of our work, really for a number of years. That led to a major scientific publication that just came out a few months ago in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. For those of you who are interested, this is going to be the main topic for our seminar or our workshop next weekend. It's all going to be about these 4 main ingredients of well-being. But I would just say maybe to step back a little bit, and then I'll talk about these four core pillars of well-being as we refer to them. The first thing to say about this framework that goes to really the origins of it. Why did we even develop this at all? And it really has to do with the amazing work that has been done over the past 4 decades or so in the scientific world to study well-being. So there's been amazing research that has been done. In fact, one of the pioneers in this area is a woman named Carol Riff, a really brilliant scientist who's actually also here at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And she and others, there's other models in addition to hers, came up with scientific frameworks to study well-being that have been incredibly illuminating and allowed for a lot of the research that's happened. But they tend to have looked at well-being as kind of a fixed entity. It's kind of something you have it or you don't. So they would measure well-being and they would kind of look at what is your level of well-being, looking at different dimensions of well-being. And then you could say, well, what's the relationship between this level of well-being and physical health, for example, or any other number of dimensions. But we felt when we looked at all of this work that there was a really important insight, and this goes back to actually some key insights from neuroscience about how the brain learns and changes over time, that really points in the direction that one way to look at well-being, at least some of the main pillars of well-being, is to really think of well-being as a skill. So our framework, the unique contribution of our framework, is really to focus on the core pillars of well-being that can be learned, that can be trained, that can be exercised, much in the way that you engage in physical exercise to strengthen different aspects of physical health. So in a nutshell, these 4 pillars that we focus on, again, all of which can be trained, all of which could be thought of as skills, are awareness, connection, insight, and purpose. So the shorthand we always use is ACIP, A-C-I-P, ACIP. So awareness, connection, insight, and purpose. So all of these are key to resilience. So each of these 4 is one of the key aspects that helps us to deal with adversity, even to learn and grow from adversity. And they are also there. They also support us when things are going well. These are the very things that we are experiencing when we are at our best, when it really feels like we're leading rich, fulfilling lives and really experiencing the kind of lives we all want for ourselves and experience when things are going well.
And so how did you come up with these 4 dimensions of well-being? Was this like a confluence of different areas? It'd be interesting to hear a little bit about the background of these 4 dimensions.
Yeah, that's an interesting story. And to summarize really years of conversation and work that we did with a whole team of people, of course, Dr. Richard Davidson and I have been having these conversations for years, but also Dr. Christy Wilson-Mundenhall, who's one of the co-authors of the framework that we published, and many, many others who have we've been having this dialogue for years with. I guess how I would summarize this is actually you use the word that's really the kind of at the heart of it, which is really the kind of confluence or the convergence of a whole range of disciplines. So we were looking at evidence from modern neuroscience, from clinical psychology, from the scientific study of well-being and positive psychology, and then also from the world's contemplative traditions, not just in Buddhism, but also in a variety of traditions. So what we really did was look across all of these different disciplines, all of these different traditions, and looked for the areas of overlap In other words, where does modern neuroscience agree with the world's meditative and contemplative traditions? And where does that line up with positive psychology and what we find in contemporary psychotherapy, for example? So one of these pillars that I mentioned, connection, is an obvious one. There is a wealth of research, a wealth of scientific research that shows that the quality of our connections with other people is not only vital for our psychological and emotional health, it's vital even for our physical health. In fact, it's on par with things like not smoking, having a healthy diet, these kind of things that we know are vital for our physical health. Having healthy, supportive relationships is as important, in some cases, even more important than those things. So you could find this in neuroscience, you can find it in other areas of research, but then you also find practices, again, going back to this idea that these are all skills that we can learn. You find practices in a range of the world's meditative, spiritual, and contemplative traditions. So there's a lot of overlap. So in a nutshell, it's really looking at the points of convergence. Where is kind of like the center of all those circles, if you put them together? Where is there broad agreement across all these different perspectives and traditions that are kind of pointing in a similar direction? So that's kind of how we came to focus on these four. And it's not that these four are the be all end all, the only four pillars of well-being. There are certainly others. These are simply the four for which there is overwhelming evidence that these are central to well-being and they can be trained.
And so when we talk about rewiring the brain, could you talk a little bit about what the scientific basis is for rewiring the brain?
Yeah, that sounds kind of like a catchy phrase or something, but actually it mirrors something that is at the heart of some modern scientific research. And actually very different than what scientists for many, many decades believed to be true about the brain. So if you go back, 20, 30 years, and you look at the prevailing view in neuroscience at the time, the view actually was pretty depressing about the human brain. The view was kind of that the brain would develop through childhood. And then once we reached adulthood, our early 20s, essentially the brain would stop developing. And the only real change that occurred was decay. So basically, I remember as a student studying psychology in my early 20s, I remember seeing some kind of chart or diagram where it kind of showed this sort of development until our early 20s, and then this decay. And I remember feeling, oh my God, this is like the peak of my brain. Like, what am I doing? Like, it's all downhill from here. It was a pretty depressing view, actually, of the human brain. But now the existing neuroscience in this area suggests that not only is the brain changing, it is dynamically changing all of the time. There are new brain cells, new neurons being generated every single day, probably every single moment. Those neurons are taken up in circuits in the brain and can support learning and transformation within the brain. So the brain is much more dynamic than scientists used to believe in the earlier days of modern neuroscience. And so this all comes down to this idea of neuroplasticity. So neuroplasticity, which is a term many of you probably heard, it simply means that the brain responds to experience. So that sounds like a good thing. Actually, it's neutral. It can be good or it can be bad. So if we are surrounded, for example, by toxic information, if we're just listening to things, listening to podcasts or reading things or having conversations that just provoke anxiety or provoke aggression or anger, then the changes that happen in the brain will actually support that. And I think we all know that we have lots of conditions in our lives that are supporting distraction. So every moment you have that alert on your phone vibrates and your attention just naturally goes to that. The wiring of our brain in these short moments is changing, right? It's as though these small changes in the brain, short-term brain states, end up leading to long-term changes in the very structure and functioning of the brain. So the fact that the brain is dynamically changing is kind of neutral. It can lead to some negative changes if we're not careful, but it also is precisely what supports positive growth and transformation, which is what can happen when we meditate, for example, or do use other strategies to train our minds.
And so curious about how these ideas or these dimensions of well-being interact with the curriculum that we teach at Tergar, which is the joy of living. So I don't want to jump to any assumptions that everyone that's watching even knows what the joy of living is. So maybe you could talk a little bit about sort of what the joy of living is and how the skills that are taught within this framework of well-being are similar or different than joy of living. I'd be curious about that.
Yeah, yep. That's another good question. So in the Tergar community, I think many of you watching this might be familiar. Some of you might not be so familiar, but there's this program, as Stephanie mentioned, called the Joy of Living, where there's 3 stages of meditation practice. The Joy of Living is basically a really comprehensive step-by-step path to learn how to meditate. And there's 3 forms of meditation. So the first is awareness meditation, which involves mindfulness training, what many of you probably understand and would recognize as mindfulness training. So the first stage of the training in the Joy of Living is mindfulness and awareness practice. The second is very much focused on this area that in our scientific framework relates to connection. So things like kindness, compassion, appreciation, and so forth. So that's what we find in the second stage of Joy of Living practice. And then the third is what is referred to as wisdom, well, which in particular refers to really the capacity to have a healthy sense of self and to start to see clearly, to see where our emotions, our beliefs, our expectations are kind of influencing and sometimes even distorting how we see ourselves and how we see other people and see situations. So in the Joy of Living, there is quite a bit of overlap between our scientific model and the training that happens in the Joy of Living. The big difference you'll see is that in our scientific model, there is this 4th pillar of purpose, which really has to do with our deeper motivations for why we do the things we do, not only what we are doing, but why we do it. So this gets at things like our guiding values and core principles, having a sense of purpose that can inform not just the kind of our big life choices, but even in small moments of life, how we can link these things up with a sense of meaning and purpose that brings a greater sense of fulfillment to what we are doing. So I would say the big difference is really this 4th pillar of purpose, which it's not that it's not there in the Joy of Living, but it's kind of more of the atmosphere of it. It's sort of implied, but not as explicitly drawn out. But the first 3, which in the Healthy Minds framework are awareness, connection, and insight, are very similar to the kinds of training that you find in Tergar's Joy of Living practices, which again relate to awareness, compassion, and wisdom. The wording is a little bit different, but they target a lot of the same strategies and practices. I'd say the big difference is mainly the lens. In the Healthy Minds framework, it's a very scientific perspective. So the emphasis is a lot on scientific research, and the strategies, the meditative practices are still there, but the lens is science, where the lens and the emphasis, you could say, in the Joy of Living is a bit more on the contemplative principles, looking at kind of the really deeply understanding what's going on in the mind and how we can train and support these qualities that lead to a sense of flourishing. But they're very similar. There's a lot of overlap for sure.
And so our guiding teacher at Tergar, Mingyur Rinpoche, has been very interested in science. And so I'm curious if you could share a little bit about Mingyur Rinpoche's interest in science and how that's sort of maybe shown up in your work and in your life.
Yeah, so Mingyur Rinpoche, it might sound like these are 2 different worlds, the world of Tergar and these Mingyur Rinpoche, and who's a monk in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, and then this kind of rigorous scientific research we do here at the university in the Center for Healthy Minds. But actually, Mingyur Rinpoche has figured prominently, obviously in Tergar, but also very much in the work we do here at the center. Actually, I'm not physically at the center, but here in Madison at the Center for Healthy Minds. So Mingyur Rinpoche, if you kind of go back to what I mentioned earlier about the Dalai Lama and his challenge to Dr. Davidson to start studying compassion and human flourishing, Mingyur Rinpoche was one of the first collaborators and actually one of the first study subjects of that early research. So this is going back more than 20 years, actually. So Mingyur Rinpoche came here. This is actually long before I myself came here. And he was a test subject in some of the very first rigorous studies of meditation. So the particular studies that he was part of became, they were later published, and I think have since become very famous studies because they were really the first research papers that were published in high profile scientific journals that kind of put the study of meditation on the map. So Mingyur Rinpoche himself has always been a bit of a geek and very interested in the scientific research. And I think he saw, not just for his own interest, but saw the value of having a scientific understanding of the mind and the brain, and how that could help us further develop methods that are going to make these practices hopefully more impactful for people in the modern world. And I think we're very much seeing that to be the case. So that was very much an early interest that he had. And similarly, Dr. Richard Davidson had an interest in collaborating with people like Mingyur Rinpoche, so he could better learn what these practices are and how we can study them effectively. So there's been all sorts of interesting research that has been done. One of the more interesting ones that has happened recently that involves Mingyur Rinpoche was made possible by the fact that Mingyur Rinpoche, as I said, had been here more than 20 years ago. And they had studied, Dr. Davidson and other scientists had gotten him in a scanner, the brain scanner, this big fMRI brain scanner, and had studied his brain and scanned his brain multiple times over this long, long period of time. And then in 2000, I think it was 2011, Mingyur Rinpoche left on a long retreat. He went on retreat, wandering in the Himalayas and in India for more than 4 years. And he came back. And when he came back, he allowed us to scan his brain one additional time. And what this allowed us to do is to look at the before and after changes in a very intensive period of meditation practice. And in particular, Dr. Davidson was looking at a phenomenon called brain age. So to summarize a lot of research and what this means, basically the brain changes over time. There's a kind of a natural atrophy, a natural decay that happens in the brain as we age. And that can be sped up by things like stress. Like stress will cause our brain to age faster, just like our physical body, but we can do things to slow that aging process. So in a nutshell, actually what this study showed, and it's been published since in the research literature, is that Mingyur Rinpoche, before he went on his retreat, he was already pretty far statistically on like having a young brain. Basically, whatever he was doing, through his deep meditation practice, it had put his brain in a very good state relative to kind of what you would normally see for his age. But when he came back from his retreat, he was just off the charts statistically. He was basically as far as you could go in terms of having a kind of a young brain, essentially having slowed that aging process of his brain. So whatever he had done in his retreat not only had affected his mind, but even had affected the way his brain was aging. So it was a pretty interesting and dramatic finding. So there's all sorts of other interesting research that he's been involved with, but he's been very, very similar. He's been very central to a lot of the work that we've done here.
Wow, that is so inspiring. I love hearing that. Thank you so much. Just a couple of more questions, I think, Court, and an invitation for you that are watching. Please take advantage of this precious opportunity to ask questions of Court and his expertise. I think there have just been a few questions that have come across, so please put your questions in the chat and we'll make sure that we answer as many as we can. So, Court, why does the science of well-being matter?
That is an incredibly important question. I think it matters for a few different ways. The first thing I would say is that everybody is different. What works for any one of us individually is going to be very different than what works for another person. And what we have in the world's wisdom traditions, in the world's contemplative and meditative traditions, is you have this wealth of strategies. You have all of these practices like mindfulness meditation or compassion meditation You have all of these strategies that are there and that are clearly impactful. But which of those strategies is going to work best for us as individuals, and which practices will work when, is really quite hard to determine. So historically, the way this happened is that it was usually very, very small groups of people who were even doing these practices or had access to them at all. And it would be monks or nuns, if it's the Buddhist tradition, or in the monastic communities of Christianity, for example, or in the modern day, it might be if you are in psychotherapy, you have this kind of very direct interaction with a therapist, for example. So in those contexts, you might be very fortunate to get very direct guidance, somebody who can examine what's going on with you, who can be asking questions, and then it can be, recommending what strategies you should use. But now we're in the space where we have apps where we can learn to meditate. We have things like this. We have YouTube and a million different things we can access. And the good part of that is that these practices are much more accessible now compared to how they've been in the past. Any one of us could get any one of a number of books or YouTube videos or apps. The downside to that is it's not possible to get this kind of personal guidance and instruction to really know what's going to work for us and when. So the scientific research in this area, I think, really helps us better understand what really is going to work for different kinds of people at different points in time. And this is the real promise, I think, of these practices. It's part of what we're doing at the Center for Healthy Minds, is coming up with these scientific measures for well-being and putting them in our phones and our smart devices, so we actually can assess our level of well-being, and then we can actually come up with a tailored path that's really actually going to fit who we are and where we are, not just assuming that there's one path of practice that's going to work for everybody equally. So that's one reason. It's simply to better understand how to help individuals and how we as individuals can best make use of these practices. But there's a lot more beyond that as well. I think to understand what's going on biologically is really important, because it has to do with our physical health. For example, when we see how meditation affects the brain, we can then begin to examine how that might affect our immune system. And then we can start getting it into the healthcare system and start to see that actually these practices through which we train our minds can be as effective, sometimes more effective than more physical types of treatments, for example, taking medication. So if we don't understand how they work in the body, the mind, and the brain, we can't really even begin to do that work. So there's many, many reasons, but these are just a few of why this is so vital to do these practices in the modern world.
Great, thank you so much. So I think I'm seeing some questions come through. I think we'll move on to asking some questions from the audience, and then I maybe have one final question for you at the end, time permitting. All right, so the first question is, what areas of the brain are most likely to change from meditation practice?
So that's a complex question, a really good question and a complex question. One way to think about this term meditation, or what meditation is to think of meditation to the mind. It's very similar to the way exercise is to the body. So there are many forms of exercise, and each form of exercise does something different to the physical body, right? So if you're on the treadmill jogging, or if you're lifting weights, or you're doing some other kind of exercise, it's going to have a different effect on the physical body. And different kinds of exercise are designed to do different things. So some might be designed to make you stronger. Some might be designed to improve your cardiovascular health. Some might be designed to improve your endurance. So the kind of exercise you do is kind of targeting something specific in your physical body. So meditation as a broad category is pretty much the same thing. You could think of meditation as simply any strategy that you use that trains your mind, and specifically is training your mind for something related to well-being or human flourishing or resilience. It's not just training the mind, but really for a specific end, which is we do this because we think it's going to contribute to our well-being or our flourishing in some way. So having said that, with that understanding, you can see that actually there are many different kinds of meditation. So there might be a practice like mindfulness, where right now, even as we're as we're here, as I'm talking and as you're listening, you can bring your attention, say, to the feeling of your feet on the floor. So if you do that intentionally right now, and you just notice the sensations of your feet on the floor, you are activating specific circuits in your brain. And the point is not your feet. Like, you might think, why would I want to bring my attention to my feet right now? It's not where you're putting your attention. It's the fact that you are consciously and intentionally directing where your attention is going right now. And this is in contrast to what's usually happening, which is our attention is pulled by our phones, or it's pulled by something going on in our environment. In fact, there are whole areas, whole sectors of our society of people who professionally are learning or trying to manipulate your attention, all of our attention, right? There are all sorts of products that are basically designed to capture our attention, to manufacture an emotional experience, usually so we'll buy something, right? So this just speaks to the importance of being in the driver's seat of our own attention, which requires intention. So I'm mentioning that because that's one very specific strategy. So again, that moment where you bring your attention to the sensations in your body, like your feet on the floor, or to your breath, or to a sound, that is going to activate specific networks in your brain, specifically areas in your prefrontal cortex that have to do with the top-down regulation of your own mental states, in this case, the top-down regulation of your attention. But it also is going to involve other networks in the brain, depending on where you're directing your attention. So if it's to the body, if it's to your physical sensations, it's going to activate another region of your brain called the insula, which has to do with this kind of sensory aspect of the physical body. But if you do a different practice, for example, if you do a practice like appreciation, so for right now, for example, if you just look around your room or wherever you are, and you just notice something positive, you notice a nice color, or you notice something, maybe there's a picture around you, and you just notice something positive, and you have this small moment of appreciation that arises. Again, you get the benefits of having done something intentionally with your own mind. And that is going to activate, again, these same networks in your brain that have to do with self-regulation, that have to do with intentionality. So that part is similar to what we just did a moment ago, or what I mentioned a moment ago with mindfulness. But it's different because this time it's not about awareness of the body, it's about appreciation. So you're going to activate networks in your brain that have to do with a feeling of connectedness, that oftentimes have a feeling of positive emotion. It feels nourishing, it feels gratifying to feel appreciation. So depending on the kind of meditation you do, you are going to activate and strengthen different circuits in your brain. So this speaks to an approach, again, like physical health, where we're not just exercising one muscle group. You don't want to just do mindfulness practice. You want to be able to strengthen both your psychological aspects, but also the brain circuits that are related to awareness, but also to connection, to insight, and purpose. All of these are important. Just like you need to work on your endurance, you need to work on your heart health, you need to have strength, you need all of these qualities to have a healthy physical body as well. So it's very similar. So the short answer is that it's very complex because there's many forms of meditation and they all do something a little bit different. And as scientists, to be totally honest, there's a lot we don't know. We have more questions about what's going on in the brain with these practices than we have answers. This whole field of science is quite new, but it's really beginning to develop, and we're learning lots of really interesting things, even in these few short years that we've been studying these practices.
Great, thank you. So a couple of questions about purpose. Is purpose the why covered by basic teachings of Mingyur Rinpoche to alleviate suffering and to bring happiness to all? How, if at all, do these teachings differ from scientific purpose?
Yeah, so that's another interesting one. So you could think of purpose. So if you look at the way we think of purpose scientifically, there's two important aspects. There's a clarity, which means that we are consciously aware of the principles, the motivations, the values that are most meaningful to us. So we're clear about what they are. and they are embodied, meaning we're actually applying them. It's not just we have some abstract idea, for example, we want to be kind or we want to make the world a better place, but we are actually embodying that in some way. We're actually applying that in our everyday life. So we need to have both of those. We might be embodying something, but not so clear about what that motivation or what the values might be. Or we could have a clear value, but somehow what we do and how we live our lives is in conflict with that, in which case it actually could undermine our well-being. So there can be many different forms of purpose, just as there can be many different values. There's not just one single life purpose that has to define everything that we do. So we could have a purpose, for example, that is simply that we want everybody to feel like they have a friend, that they have somebody in their corner, right? And that could drive the way we interact with people, that when we're with people, we simply treat them with respect and dignity. For our friends and family, we try to be caring and empathetic. And that one guiding purpose can show up in many, many different ways. So we can have many different forms of purpose, but I think this, the question points to, again, this goes back to Stephanie, what you asked earlier with the joy of living, which is Tergar's path, that path of meditation training that was created by Mingyur Rinpoche. A lot of the emphasis in that form of practice has to do with this very vast aspiration to want to help all beings be free from suffering and for all beings to truly flourish. And that certainly is one very powerful, very potent form of purpose. So there can be other, that's not the only one we can have. There are certainly other forms of purpose, but this particular one that that you mentioned in the question is important because what scientists understand, or what scientists would refer to as the self-transcendent quality of the purpose. In other words, and actually there's great research on this, say you're going to school, like there's been really cool research done on university students. I think we'll talk about this next weekend in some depth for those of you who attend. For example, if you in your education think, I'm getting educated, I'm doing this degree because I want to make a lot of money, or I want to have a really good career. That's fine. You know, we all need to make a living. It's not that we shouldn't have those motivations, but those motivations don't seem to be so supportive of well-being, at least from what we know scientifically. But students who have a motivation that is self-transcendent, so for example, thinking, I'm going to get this degree, not just for my career, which I need, not just because I need to make a living, which I do, but also because I want to give back to my community, because I want to be able to help others in my community. When you have that kind of self-transcendent purpose, it really seems to bolster well-being. It makes us more resilient when things are challenging, and it really helps us feel like we're at our best when things are going well. So this motivation to want to help all beings be free from suffering, to help all beings to flourish, is one way where we can bring that kind of transcendent, that self-transcendent motivation to something as simple as being mindful of our breath. So when we sit down to meditate in the morning, so some of you might have a mindfulness practice, you could sit down to do that same activity. Like your intention might be, I'm going to be aware of my breath for these 10 minutes or 20 minutes. I'm going to train my attention and learn to be more mindful by being aware of my breath. You could do that because you want to be less stressed out. You could do that because everybody else seems to be meditating and you don't want to be left behind. But you could do that with the intention to be more present and aware for your family and friends. You could do that even to think, I can see how distracted the world is, and I want to do my part to make the world a little bit more present, a little more grounded and centered, right? So the act is the same. It's just bringing awareness to the breath, but you can bring vastly different motivations to that. You can link that simple action to a profound sense of purpose. And when you do, again, scientifically, and also from these contemplative traditions, it shows that this has all of these powerful ripple effects in terms of our own well-being. So it's a great question, and it points to something really important about these practices, which is simply our motivation and being very conscious about the motivation we bring, not only to meditation, but really to everything that we do in life.
Great. There's another question about purpose. Many people I talk to say they are struggling with finding purpose and meaning in their life. Are there specific practices to help someone find purpose, or is this an outcome of ASIP practice?
Yeah, so this, I think we can look to some of the exemplars of purpose. So if you look at some of the most inspiring people who you can think of, like some of you might have heard of Malala. You know, she won the Nobel Peace Prize. She's, for those of you who don't know who she is, she's a young woman. I think she's from rural Pakistan, if memory serves. And she had been not able to get an education. She was in one of these areas where young women were not allowed to go to school. And so she basically became an activist in her community, which over here, you know, in the United States, you know, might be challenging, but over there is a matter of life and death. She was literally receiving death threats and just tremendous adversity, in addition to the adversity that she'd already experienced, simply being a young woman in a community where she was really not being given the just basic rights of, you know, being able to get an education. And so she went on to become, you know, this great world leader. She won the Nobel Peace Prize. To this day, she's, you know, one of the great young leaders of the world. And I mention her because, like, you could find many examples like her. The Dalai Lama is another great example. Nelson Mandela is another example that we often reference in this area. But you can see that it's not that she's like living some amazing life of like, you know, where everything is just going well. Actually, it was through tremendous adversity and her perspective on the challenges she faced that allowed her to transform something that might have been an overwhelmingly challenging situation into not only something that helped her learn and grow, but allowed her to even bring tremendous benefit to others, just being a beacon of inspiration to so many other people around the world. So what the science in this area shows, like we can see from the story of Malala, is that it is not being free from challenges or being free from all the mundane details of life that allows us to feel that life is meaningful and rewarding, but rather that it's our perspective, that we can shift our perspective on the highs, the lows, and everything in between in our life in such a way that we actually can link all of this to our deeper sense of purpose and meaning. And I would say that as a strategy, the key point of all of this is to see that actually it's not that we lack values or we lack a sense of purpose. It's simply that we haven't clarified it. So again, the strategy to go about how we actually define that sense of clarity is to take something. You could take something as simple as doing the dishes. Like before I jumped on this webinar, I realized, actually I told my wife, my back has been hurting and she's been an all-star and kind of helping me over the past few days. And I told her, hey, hon, I think I can do the dishes later. Thanks for holding down the kitchen for these past few days. And I just told her, like, leave the dishes, I'll do that, you know, after I do my webinar. This is just an example. So typically we would do something mundane like that. We wouldn't even think about it, right? And we would just think, oh, it's just this meaningless task. I need to get through it. And then maybe later I'll do something more meaningful. But if you look deeper, even at something as seemingly meaningless as doing the dishes, you can ask a few questions and find that there probably is a deeper sense of purpose. So why am I doing the dishes? Well, obviously I'm doing it because the kitchen's a mess and I want to clean the kitchen. Well, why do I want to do that? Well, you know, I want my wife and son for myself to have a clean home. And why do I want that? Because I want them to be happy. I want them to feel that the place that they live feels like home and they want to be here and they feel a sense of home and connection here. So I could find even in this simple activity that there's something really meaningful. There is a sense of purpose. It's just that I don't usually think about it or see it in that moment. So again, the key here is not to think that we have to change what we do, but rather to change the perspective on what we do. And especially, and Stephanie, you teach this a lot as well, and I've heard you say this many times, just treat it like a fun, playful exercise. This is not like this heavy, soul-searching thing. We need to find like the one sense of purpose that's going to define everything. Just to treat it like an experiment. Almost just, you know, if you can't find something, make something up. Like, okay, what if I viewed going for a walk as a way to model physical health for others? Maybe somebody will see me going for a walk and it would inspire them to go for a walk. Who knows? Just keep it light and playful and experiment. So in other words, it's just really about the perspective, and we can slowly over time, I think what you'll find is that it's difficult at first, but once you get used to it, actually you can find this sense of purpose and meaning a lot easier. It just takes a little work to get used to that kind of inner movement of clarifying it for yourself.
The next question is about trauma. What can your research tell us about supporting individuals who have experienced trauma to heal from the adaptive functions that their brains made in order to survive, but now torment them?
Yeah, there is a lot of really interesting research. In fact, purpose, which we just talked about, this is one of the areas where there's a lot of research showing that these 4 pillars of well-being, awareness, connection, insight, and purpose, and here specifically purpose, since we're talking about it, are not only important for our well-being and human flourishing, but actually in recovering from trauma. That a sense of purpose can be one of these things that is can really help us or help determine whether we are going to be overwhelmed by a traumatic experience, or we actually can to get through it. Again, to use this phrase I've been using many times, we can even learn and grow. So many of you have probably heard of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which is what happens when there's a traumatic experience. It kind of gets under the skin into our biology, and then years later, we can still be having this kind of traumatic response, which of course is totally normal. These are, as you said, Stephanie, and as we found in the question, this is simply what we needed to do to protect ourselves. So it's completely normal that we have this protective mechanism. So you've probably heard of PTSD, which is when that can almost stay with us, even at a biological level, when it's no longer serving an adaptive function, and can begin to become destructive. But you might not have heard of another phenomenon that's called post-traumatic growth. So this is when a similarly traumatic situation can learn to breakthroughs, can lead to insights, can lead to connection and empathy and so forth. So there's a lot of research on this area. And one of the areas of research shows that the sense of purpose can be one of these key ingredients. So there's been work, for example, on Pakistani earthquake survivors that shows that those who had a strong sense of purpose were able to be much more resilient after this natural disaster. There's been other work showing, for example, in the US, African-American populations who had a lot of trauma in childhood, if you look at what allowed them to be resilient, that there's factors related to insight. For example, having a healthy, clear sense of self, even having had a lot of trauma in childhood, that having a degree of insight was protective towards that trauma. So one way to look at that is just people who had a sense of purpose or who have higher levels of insight will be less likely to experience things like PTSD. But the research now is showing that these strategies that we've been talking about here actually can be learned. So we don't just have to accept the hand we're dealt with. We don't have a strong sense of purpose. We can actually develop that sense of purpose. And again, there are many, many practical ways and practical strategies to do that. So again, this is where I think science can be really helpful, because it can help show for specific kinds of people which of those strategies is likely to be the most helpful. So for example, some people starting with mindfulness can be really challenging, especially if you have trauma that might have related to the physical body. If you do a practice that's telling you to bring your awareness into your body, that can not only not be helpful, that can trigger the very trauma that you're trying to deal with. So there might be other strategies, for example, a sense of self-compassion and self-appreciation in some cases, or a practice where you might come back to core values. So like one strategy would be to think about times in your life where you had a difficult time, but you handled it well. And then you could say, all right, well, what values were going on there that actually helped me deal with that well? And usually we can find things like, oh, I really took time to care for myself. Maybe self-care was a value. Or I really was able to be supported by my friends and family. So being able to receive the support of others, and having those caring connections, again, might be a value. So again, it's just clarifying that. So again, there's no one size fits all here. And I think with trauma in particular, it really takes a kind of We need a lot of tools in our toolbox, and then we need to be able to see which ones are likely to be the ones that are going to help us, depending on what the background was and what the traumatic experience was. But the hopeful piece of this is that there's a lot of evidence now that these skills can be trained, and they can make a real difference, especially for people who might have experienced trauma in their lives.
Great, thank you. Does enlightenment play a role in your scientific research?
Wow, that's a big question. I would say, in one way, no. As I mentioned earlier, to study something scientifically, you need to be able to measure it, right? You start usually with some theoretical principle, but then you need to translate that into some way that you actually can measure something. So we take something like well-being as an example. And we had this, in our framework, we started with this idea of well-being. And then we thought, okay, we really want to focus on something that's missing in the current scientific paradigm, which is dimensions of well-being that can be learned and trained. So that was kind of our theoretical construct. And then we went one level deeper. And as I mentioned earlier, tried to determine what are those qualities that we think can be trained. So we came up with these 4 of awareness, connection, insight, and purpose. On that basis, we can then form measurements, right? And we're actually doing this these days and have already done work that is, for example, coming up with a very clear definition of awareness and then thinking of different strategies to measure it. So the problem with something like enlightenment, which is it's a word, a term you find in Asian contemplative traditions in particular. You find it in Buddhism, you find the same word in Hinduism, is that even within these traditions, and in my work as a translator, translating Tibetan texts from Tibetan to English, I've done a lot of work in that area. Even within the Buddhist tradition, that word is understood differently in different contexts. So the reason why I think that principle and similar principles haven't received that much scientific attention is, one, because there's so many definitions, and 2, because it's simply really hard to measure. So from that point of view, I would say, no, it doesn't, that's not a word or a construct you'll see a lot in scientific literature. Having said that, there is some very interesting work, including work that we have done at the Center for Healthy Minds, that has pointed to the possibility of even biological transformations that are radically different than what scientists at one point thought were possible. So I mentioned the story about Miguel Rinpoche and his quality of brain age. There is another phenomenon that refers to a form of brain activity called gamma activity or gamma oscillations. So this form of brain activity is related. It's related to a number of things, but among the various things it's related to moments of insight. So if you're kind of really trying to work out some difficult problem, and then you have this aha moment where you suddenly get it, there is likely a flash of gamma activity happening in your brain. Well, research that happened early on, this was before I was here, but Dr. Davidson, another brilliant scientist who's also very involved with the Tergar community named Antoine Lutz, who's in France, they did some work studying Miguel Rinpoche and other advanced meditators, and found that when they did this specific form of meditation that has to do with this, what you call non-dual pure awareness infused with compassion, it's a practice called non-referential compassion, to use the kind of the wonky Buddhist term for it, that they were able to sustain these periods of gamma activity. Usually this happens only for flashes in the brain. It's very transient and intermittent, but they found these meditators were actually able to have sustained levels of gamma activity far beyond what is typically seen by scientists studying this phenomena. So what does that actually mean? Frankly, I don't think we quite know. Again, we can just simply measure that it's happening, and we know they're doing this specific form of very advanced meditation. But it helps open our eyes and expand our horizons, so to speak, and suggest that the mind can be trained, and the brain can be radically changed in terms of its functioning and even the structure to allow for a much broader range of human experience than we typically think is possible. So is that enlightenment or not? I mean, I think that's sort of beyond what scientists can say, but I would say it's pointing in the direction to really think beyond what we normally think of as the kind of the range of what's possible for the human mind and the human brain. So again, this is just beginning. There's way more questions than answers, but there's some really interesting science that's just opening things up in this way.
Well, I'm so sorry to say that our time is winding down and coming to an end. Court, I have just one more question for you, which is what are your hopes for this work going forward?
I think, my main aspiration, which is not just mine, but I know yours since we work together at the center, and Dr. Davidson, all the scientists. It's a very big center. We have, I think, more than 100 scientists and researchers and staff, in addition to the work we do with Healthy Minds Innovation. So it's a very big team. And I think for all of us, I think we're really seeing two things. One, simply that the level of suffering in the world is really just at epidemic levels. If you go back 100 or 1,000 years, a lot of the human misery, the intense suffering that was happening around the world was really due to external circumstances. It was famine, it was war, it was all these kind of external circumstances. And it's not as though we've transcended that. We have the pandemic now, we have economic upheaval, there are wars happening. So it's not as though that has gone away, but statistically, actually, that suffering is we've made tremendous improvement as a species in that area. We've got a lot of work to do, but it is dramatically transformed. But if you look at the developed world, again, in less economically privileged areas, the situation is different. But for a lot of us, we might have enough to eat. We don't have to worry about war. So again, this is not to say there's not major societal and systemic issues. There are. But for a lot of people in this era, the main suffering is psychological. It's emotional suffering. So you see for a lot of people, their income might be fine. Their physical health might be relatively good. The life expectancy might be relatively high. But the levels of depression, the levels of anxiety, attention-related disorders, and then real world problems like suicide, for example. These things are just at epidemic levels. And even before the pandemic, these were at epidemic levels. So I think we're really seeing that while we need to continue to work with societal, systemic injustice, we need to certainly work where there are wars and famine and all these things. We can't let up in our concern for that. That we really need a lot more work on our mind and our emotions. And people simply need tools, as I did, and I know you did, Stephanie, because I know you have a story like this. We just need ways to work with our mind and emotions in healthy ways. Plus, we have modern technology that allows us to get these practices and strategies into people's hands. So our aspiration, I think, is that through the depth of the wisdom in the world's contemplative and meditative traditions and what we're learning from modern science, that we really could just get these insights and practices and strategies and tools into people all over the world, starting with young kids. So young kids can learn them in school. We're doing work in universities. When kids come from high school and transition to university, it's a really stressful time, they can learn them. And then of course, people who are later in life and adults can get access to these tools when they need them most. So I think it's really just seeing that there's this great potential we have when we train the mind in this way and we learn to meditate. And anybody can do it. You don't have to be Buddhist, you don't have to be religious, you can be an atheist, you can be whatever, and it can bring a depth and a meaning in a way that really can be transformative. So I think that's our hope, is just that this can really reach a much wider group of people than it has historically, where it's been for just a kind of a privileged few that have done these practices.
Well, thank you so much, Court, for all of the inspiring information. And I apologize to those of you that we did not get a chance to answer your questions. Perhaps you will feel inclined to join us for the full program on April 10th and 11th with Dr. Cortland Dahl and Dr. Richard Davidson. It is going to be a workshop, a 2-day workshop on the meditating brain. I'm assuming, Court, that there will be opportunities for people to ask questions. And so if you didn't get your questions answered today, there might be another opportunity for you to be able to ask questions during this workshop. Also, if you're interested in learning more about the Joy of Living programs that we talked about earlier in our webinar today, please check out tergar.org/joy. Lots of opportunities to learn more, to deepen your meditation practice. What I feel like is so beneficial about the Joy of Living is that you can return to these practices again and again and gain new insight, learn more about yourself, learn more about your practice, and continue to develop the capacity to be resilient when times are tough and to flourish when things in your life are going well. So really wishing you well. Thank you so much from Court and myself for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you at a future event.
Yeah, thank you so much, Stephanie. Great to connect with you all. Take care.